This panel is really intended to set up what I call highly innovative approaches to trial design, trial platforms. The idea that each of these trials and platforms in their own way have broken out of the quote-unquote traditional mold. So each will speak about their particular trial and or platform as we go along for about 20 minutes or so, and then we've left 15 minutes at the end to ask questions. So please, I hope you'll prepare your thoughts as each of them is speaking. Let me first introduce Dr. Enrique Sanz Garcia, who is a medical oncologist and staff physician at the Princess Margaret Cancer Center, with a clinical focus on head and neck and gastrointestinal cancers. He also serves as the scientific co-lead for the Marathon of Hope Cancer Center Network program at Princess Margaret, chairs the Molecular Tumor Board for this initiative, and co-chairs the working group for the development of a prospective study to bring precision medicine to cancer patients across Canada. Dr. Sanz Garcia will be specifically speaking about the Octane trial. We also welcome Dr. Pascale Landry, who is an accomplished clinical research professional with over 2 decades of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, specializing in clinical trial operations and site engagements. Most recently, Dr. Landry has worked on GlaxoSmithKline's Azure program, which is what she will be speaking to us about this afternoon. And last but not least, we welcome Dr. Samira Apte, who is a surgical oncologist and colorectal surgeon at the Ottawa Hospital, who I understand works very closely with Dr. Auer. Dr. Apte helped conceptualize and launch the REACT remote, what's called RNR, I'll use the short form, I hope that's okay with you, pragmatic surgical trials platform. So we'll be getting to learn more about each of those 3 areas, and I'm going to ask Enrique to come and share his thoughts first.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for the presentation, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here today in this amazing conference for patient-centered trials. I'm a medical oncologist by training. My areas of research are basically precision medicine, and I also do clinical trials, and I think we need to make sure that all the trials that we are involved in, they are centered on patients, and that the research that we do comes back into care of patients, which is the slogan from this conference. So I'm going to present today the Octane program on behalf of all the people who have made that possible. The Octane program has been open for the last almost 10 years across Ontario, and I want to say that this has been possible because of many people, but especially due to the lead of Dr. Philippe Bedard, who couldn't join us today, and Dr. Benjamin Heibskan. So for those of you who are not familiar with Octane, Octane is an Ontario-wide initiative to try to bring precision medicine to patients with cancer across the province. This initiative, which as mentioned before, started back in 2016, has been open in different centers from London to Kingston and Ottawa, and a total of 6,000 patients have been benefited from this program. The main benefit for the patients have been to get access to next-generation sequencing reports, which is something that for many tumor types, I would say for the majority of tumor types, is not funded by the government of Ontario. So patients going into this research, we were able to get back a report that could potentially help into their care, as I will show you later. Apart from getting access to next-generation sequencing, this initiative has been made possible to get many samples and blood plasma collections to make sure that in the future we can do further research with those samples. One of the main characteristics of this program is that it has been linked to health administrative data, and you will see some examples of how this can be used to get some conclusions regarding the value of next-generation sequencing in this population. And finally, and I think also very important, all the information that has been generated in Octane, more specifically from the patients of Princess Margaret, has been able to be shared across the world with other clinicians and researchers to learn more about cancer and ultimately, hopefully, impacting on patients in the future. Okay, perfect. So those are the numbers of Octane as of early October. You see that the study is currently only open in Ottawa and at Princess Margaret, because basically both Ottawa and Princess Margaret are taking over the cost of the sequencing. But you can see that since early 2016 until now, 6,000 patients, almost 6,000 patients, have been consented and recruited. And you see all the centers that have participated on this. When you look into the accruals, you can see very clearly in this graph how the numbers were quite high prior to COVID. And then you see clearly on Q2 of 2020 that the numbers got much smaller. That was because there was some restrictions for research in all the centers because of the COVID pandemic. And shortly after that, the funding for the next generation sequencing was completed. Therefore, only 2 centers, Ottawa and Princess Margaret, continued recruiting on that. You can see, though, that at the end of this Q3, there is a huge increase at Princess Margaret of almost 247 patients. I will explain you at the end of the presentation why that happened and what are the goals of that increase. When you look to tumor types, you see here that there is a distribution across different tumor types. From the big ones like breast cancer, colorectal cancer, GI malignancies, and also gynecological malignancies, to other more rare like head and neck cancer, skin cancer, or unknown primaries. I want to highlight that, for example, despite lung cancer being a very aggressive tumor and quite common in our population, the numbers were much lower in Octane, and that's because, as you may be aware, next-generation sequencing in lung cancer is funded and is covered, right? So many patients could not be recruited into this study because they got next-generation sequencing by standard means. The second goal of the Octane program was to try to build a biospecimen repository with both tissue and plasma. You can see here how in the last 10 years we have been able to collect more than 3,000 samples and almost 4,000 plasma samples. Many of those samples have been used for research in other initiatives, but many of them are still stored, and we are hoping that in the future we can use them to learn more about patients' cancer and also to try to bring the research back to care. One question that one can have about Octane is whether this is cost-effective, right? And whether doing next-generation sequencing and putting patients into the Octane program was something that was worth from a cost perspective, but also from an outcome perspective. And this is a very nice paper that was published last year by different members of the Octane program. And I was lead with one of my colleagues, Dr. Hernando and Dr. Bedard. And you can see that in this study they compare how did patients with Octane did versus patients with matched controls, meaning that we were comparing exactly with the same population, but not in Octane, right? You see that there is a higher mean healthcare cost, meaning that patients on Octane, they spend more money for the system. But I think we think that's mainly because there were more visits for trials and more patients for specialists, and that may be probably a bias on those results. But when you look about whether Octane has reduced the number of health drug costs, meaning how much money you have spent for publicly funding drugs, you can see that the cost was smaller. And that's mainly because many of these patients could go into trials that made sure that those patients, they would not have to pay for any off-label drugs, or they could potentially participate in new therapies. This study didn't show a particular improvement in survival, but I want to caution about that because, as I mentioned, this is not a randomized study, and this is just compared to matched controls, and I think it's very difficult to try to establish difference in terms of overall survival in this population. So I will not take this as a conclusion that next-generation sequencing and precision medicine doesn't improve survival, because I think that's not the reality based on these results. The final point I want to highlight is that Octane was very useful to try to match patients to clinical trials. And that increased from 9.5% in patients who didn't go into Octane versus 25%, so 1/4 of every patient who go into Octane, meaning that this initiative make possible patients not only to participate to this research, but also to go into other research that could impact in their care. The other question that we have is not about cost, it's about clinical utility, and I think I have highlighted before that Octane let people go into clinical trials more often than standard therapies. But I want to highlight this paper that was published last year by the Princess Margaret Group in GCO Precision Oncology, and you can see here that there were basically a total of 400 surveys sent to physicians who have enrolled patients in Octane, and those physicians were asked whether the Octane changed their treatment decision, whether the patient could go into a trial based on Octane, and what was their interpretation of the results generated by the next generation sequencing. And as you can see here, almost half of the surveys shows that patients that have Octane and have next generation sequencing were classified to have at least an actionable alteration, meaning that we can try to ask for a drug for this patient, or we can prevent that patient to get a drug that could be potentially not effective and harmful because of those molecular characteristics. But most importantly, once again, I want to show you that 15.7% of the patients were matched to a specific treatment based on the results of the next generation sequencing. It goes from 47.7% to 15.7%, so there is a drop of around 30% of people who didn't go into matched treatment. That's because the next generation sequencing was done very late, and that's something that we should advocate to try to do that, to be done this early on the diagnosis, and I think that's something that we are moving forward with that. And second, and most importantly, access to these drugs and access to clinical trials, right? So those were the two reasons why there were 30% of people who, despite being having a match for a specific treatment, they couldn't go into that. And you can see that the majority of the patients went into clinical trials because of funding restrictions and opportunities for patients, but there was also another 20% who were able to be matched to an approved drug, another 6% that they could go in off-label therapy. As I mentioned before, having a matched therapy doesn't mean to have only a drug that can work, but also to try to prevent you to receive a drug that can be ineffective. And we were able also to see that in 13% of the patients on this study. The last goal of Octane was to try to generate data that could be shared across the world to learn more about cancer. And the patients who underwent Octane in Princess Margaret, their data was shared through the ACCR Project Genie. The Project Genie is probably the largest initiative across the world to try to provide clinical and molecular data of cancer patients in a very sophisticated way and very transparent. And basically, the results are shared with the community, and then this is going to be used by any researcher to make or generate new questions. And this is done thanks to the support of ACCR. UHM was one of the founding members at the time of starting Genie, and as you can see below, 2,700 patients from Princess Margaret have been included in this initiative, bringing their data and their molecular results to this database to generate further information. And across the world, there is almost 2,500 samples that are shared, and Genie is probably, at this point, one of the most important databases from molecular and clinical research. And many of us, we have access to this data, and we can generate new questions and try to discover better about cancer. Finally, I want to highlight, when I was speaking before about Octane, why in Princess Margaret there has been an increase of 200 patients in the last 3 months. And this is basically thanks to the support of a Marathon of Hope Cancer Center Network, which is an initiative that has been led by the Terry Fox Foundation, that you all are aware about that. So Marathon of Hope has been running through the last 4 years. Indeed, we are almost finishing the first part by March 2026. And basically, the goal of that network is to create, to bring precision medicine to patients by getting a more sophisticated analysis of the tumor, moving into whole genome and transcriptome sequencing, and also to trying to facilitate collaboration between different centers to try to advance in cancer. In the last few months, we have switched from doing next generation sequencing to these patients to do whole genome transcriptome sequencing, so we can try to increase the numbers based on the budget that was generated by Health Canada, as well as to learn more about these patients. And at this point, Octane has shifted into performing whole genome transcriptome sequencing, which basically is not to look just 500 genes and specific mutations, but to look to all the genome and all the RNA, and try to see whether that could be better than the next generation sequencing approach. Moreover, this initiative is allowing us also for patients who don't have archival tissue or that they don't qualify for Octane, that they can still be accessible to receive this whole genome transcriptome sequencing by offering them to do a biopsy to get this analysis done. And we have been quite broad on this. We are including not only patients with advanced disease, we are also including patients with stage 2 or stage 3 that they can recur, because we believe that precision medicine needs to start from the beginning, and we need to learn from the beginning of the disease, and we also need to be prepared if the cancer comes back with this kind of analysis. What is the main end of this initiative? So as I mentioned to you, Marathon of Hope is closing the first part by mid-March, so we are trying to recruit as much patients as possible so we can get the more information for patients and also for research. But there is a hope, and we think it's going to be the case, that this is going to be moving forward to many other places in Canada. And indeed, we have been working in a protocol and in a consent that will allow, hopefully, many centers across the world, across the country, to get access to this whole genome transcriptome sequencing. So the patient get a report with those results. It's generated by a research facility, but then that report comes back to a molecular tumor board where researchers and clinicians are together, and then we can make some recommendations about potential drugs and potential therapies that can be useful for patients. The next step, and this is also integrated on this, is to try to look for potential drugs that could be matched to those alterations, and this is the work that hopefully with the support of Terry Force Foundation plus Health Canada and others we may be able to fulfill in the next 3 to 5 years. And that's everything I wanted to speak about. Those are the acknowledgements for everything that we have done through Octane in Ontario and also Princess Margaret. It takes a village about that, and you can see here just a small representation of the people who help on that. But I think the most important thing about Octane and about Marathon of Hope is the support of patients, and many patients, they undergo all this research not expecting anything from them, and I think that's very important. But in this particular research, both Octane and Marathon of Hope, we are also bringing back some hope to patients, giving them a report that probably for the majority of patients will not change the approach, but as I mentioned, about 15% of the people may have a different therapy, and I think we need to make sure that patients are aware about that and they can get access to these initiatives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enrique. I'm going to suggest that we hear all of the presentations and then come back and ask questions. So write things down as they come to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my knowledge and experience with you expert groups here. It's really nice to be in a forum where we can exchange from our different perspectives. So today I'll be discussing the theme Research is Care and Care is Research in line with the theme of this year's conference and how we can unlock faster innovation for better access, outcome, and hope. So my name is Pascale Landry. I'm a site engagement lead with GSK, spent most of my career managing clinical trials, and within the last few years I've taken a step back to be less close to the trials themselves, but closer to the sites probably. So at GSK, we do believe that research and care are interconnected. By focusing on patient-centered approaches, we aim to improve clinical trial experience for patients while advancing science and innovation. However, our research showed that enrollment in clinical trials in oncology studies remain a challenge. The recruitment is a challenge. A substantial portion of oncology clinical trials globally cannot fulfill their recruitment targets. So how can we overcome these obstacles, bringing the trials to the patient and the patients to the trial? I don't know how this works. Just
yes, got them right there. I've got it.
The green one. Yeah. So that's the only thing. It's just collaboration. That's what we need to do. Collaboration is the foundation of successful research and care. At GSK, we emphasize proactive collaboration and strong partnerships to make our clinical trials a success, as I'm sure other sponsors would tell you the same. So one of our constant obsession is attracting clinical trials in Canada. Close internal collaborations between our medical group and our clinical development group is crucial. So I'm going to talk about Azure, the Azure studies, but also overall what we aim to do and what we try to do, focusing mainly on 3 pillars: how we interact with sites, how sites can make a difference, and then how we can collaborate with patients. So one of the examples where for us a close collaboration was really, really impactful was with the Azure 1 trial. Initially, we had 3 sites selected to participate in Canada, but through the contacts of one investigator, we learned that another doctor, not an investigator, was really, really interested in the trial. So internally, we had meetings with our global colleagues, calls and meetings and calls and convincing and lobbying, so we could finally end up adding this additional site and opening this additional site in Sherbrooke. It took extensive discussion, but we were allowed to do it, and then this led to having patients having access to innovative treatment, so far with good reasons to be enthusiastic about the outcome. It is shocking to think that it almost didn't happen. This highlights the importance of being proactive in our engagements with investigators' sites and the researchers to bring studies to Canada. We have a wealth of experience, a wealth of experts, clinical researchers, and healthcare professionals, many of whom are authors, are advisory board members, are part of steering committees, are very active scientifically and in the healthcare world. So this helps us build the case for Canada, and to help us convince our global partners to put the trials here in our local environments. So this is the key. If investigators want to see clinical studies conducted in Canada, they should rapidly liaise with medical colleagues, with sponsor medical teams, clinical teams, and so together we can bring these studies here. Also, through early pipeline presentation, what we aim to do is really to provide researchers with valuable visibility on what's coming. Upcoming advancement and opportunities. Researchers can see what's coming on our end, and by engaging investigators early, we can also include their feedback, their insight, incorporate how the earliest possible, if we can make some changes to the protocols, this is by collaborating and exchanging openly through early engagement. So this not only enhances our trials and the quality of our trials, but also strengthen the partnership that we have with you and that you have with patients, because this is also a way to funnel in the patient experience. So breaking the barriers to participation is critical for enabling patients access and ensuring diversity in clinical trials. Collaborations with advocacy groups like QCRO, for example, or with Colorectal Cancer Canada are essential in this regard. These organizations help us learn and understand patient pathways and be more patient-focused. One important role that they can also play is to help us identify sites that may not be on our radar, that we have maybe not worked with before. Those networks also create, those organizations also help support and create professional networks, such as Community of Practice that QCRO is leading, which is a great innovative model to collaborate between the sites and to offer more support to patients. They also do tremendous work in raising awareness. We've heard this before this morning again, how important it is to raise awareness and provide education not only to patients but also to healthcare providers to raise awareness on clinical trial participation. They are very instrumental, and they have been, so maybe less with Azure 1, but with Azure 2, we have collaborated closely with patient navigators. We tried to identify patients through Onco Quebec tool and linking investigators with each other to help and support some referencing of the patient. As an innovative medicine organization, we share the responsibility to offer trials to the most diverse population that we can. We commit to exploring paths that expand our usual suspect or the usual collaborators we deal with. To do this, we need to go off the beaten path. It is really important for us to be able to not only conduct the trials in big, urban, well-equipped, high-tech centers, but also in suburban, rural community hospitals. It is important that we take the trials to where the patients are. Another key aspect of early site engagement that I want to touch on is overcoming administrative barriers. By partnering with sites early, by partnering with organizations such as Catalyst, for example, we try to identify how we can start up studies faster. So having all the initial conversation, trying to come to agreements before starting the trial to help the site protect their recruitment time. It is nice to be able to start fast, but the goal, we should never forget, is to allow sites to have the full window of recruitment. This will help sites reach out to the patients and take the time they need to find those patients. Of course, and we've talked a little bit about AI today. Having tools that will help drill down the data to identify the patient is also core. It is really essential for all communities to be able to know their patient population, provide robust feasibility data so you and us don't waste resources and know where to place the resources adequately. There is a new model that I've heard about that is trying to be implemented in the US, and I don't know for Canada yet. We've not done it at GSK already. But they talk about a just-in-time study startup. So you would have a main parent study site, and then the other sites are satellite sites, but they would be opened up only once they identify a patient, agreeing to just mirror the agreements that have been made with the parent site. So we are thinking about those possibilities and innovative ways to bring the trials to the patient with, in all respect of your resources, limited, and our resources that are also limited. Oh, I thought I was sharing the system. Yeah. So the patients need to be at the center of all our actions, and we should be supporting patients through each step of the trial process, making research a personalized care experience. And this translates into a number of initiatives. So we're dedicated to creating patient-centered study design that prioritize well-being and convenience to participants. As much as possible, we try to minimize invasive procedures, and we focus on simplifying protocols by using standard of care assessment and avoiding duplication of assessment. This reduces the burden on patients and ensures smoother trial experience. Remote patient follow-up is another innovation that lowers travel requirements, making participation more accessible and improving adherence to the protocol. We want to invest more resources and more efforts into offering trials where we can explore further satellite sites, telemedicine, remote consents, remote PROs or patient-reported outcome questionnaires, to reduce the patient discomfort and travel needs. Additionally, we are increasingly interested in developing a framework of satellite sites. This is not an easy task. We have not been successful really in the past because our internal logistic is very complicated. Where do you have the IP delivered? Who is responsible? Who has the oversight? But we care to implement this. So we've not been, it has not been already rolled out worldwide or globally, but we are, GSK as a company, really looking for opportunities to do so, even if it's a very micro-local plane. We also try to provide robust patient accommodation and support through reimbursement of their expenses, but also stipend of their time. IRBs have more and more been agreeable to the fact that not only do we reimburse patients for the cost that has incurred to them, but also compensate them adequately for their time and their participation. We are quite aware that we don't want to be buying patients. That is not at all our goal, but we want to recognize that they are sacrificing their time and their quality of life to participate in the trial, and we want to be supportive of that. So as we look to the future, it's clear that collaboration, education, awareness will play a critical role in advancing clinical trials. Informing patients about trials as part of their care journey and engaging healthcare professionals and providers are essential steps. We will continue to invest in telemedicine, to reduce travel requirements for patients, to explore ways to use technology to our advantage, and to collect more data more efficiently. By doing so, we aim to make trials more accessible, more inclusive, and tailored to the needs of the diverse patient population. So I'm sure you've heard other testimonies like the one I'm about to do, but I'll just put my brick to this wall. 30 years ago, my mother, at age of 57, passed away from colorectal cancer. I am convinced that under the same circumstances today, she would get access to a trial and maybe even potentially have survived. Our collective mission is to advocate for all of those who couldn't. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to exchanging more on the topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascale.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for letting me speak today and having the opportunity. This is a really cool conference and not one I've actually been to before, so this is kind of nice. Today I wanted to tell a story about a trial that we're doing at the Ottawa Hospital regarding colorectal surgery patients. It's called the React-NISQUIP Remote Trial. And it's really, I think, in line with this conference and what it's all about, really trying to make trials simple for patients and for things that patients are gonna be able to do easily. So I have no conflicts. Just real quickly, because I don't know everyone's backgrounds, but surgical site infections, we really define them 3 ways. One is at the wound site of the surgery itself, also as an abscess or fluid collection in the abdomen, and thirdly, kind of the most dreaded complication for surgeons like me, is a leak where we join the colon together. So why are SSIs important for patients? Well, they're very, very common. In Canada, we do about 21,000 colorectal cancer surgeries a year. And importantly, I think for the trial we did here, but also in general, about half of these are done at community sites or non-academic sites as well. And of those patients, about 5 to 20% suffer an SSI. They're really morbid, so they dramatically increase length of stay. They increase invasive procedures like having to drain abscesses or repeat surgeries, increase antibiotic usage and resistance. And patients get really deconditioned. They get into a catabolic state and not really able to recover from that as quickly. And finally, they predict mortality, which obviously is very, very important. It also really damages the patient experience. So these patients with SSIs, even if they're just superficial wound infections, they have a really poor return to their baseline function. This is especially true in the elderly populations. They have a higher rate of chronic pain. They have hernias, because that is the highest risk factor for hernia, dehiscences, scars, all things that require other really big, really major operations. And finally, for all of us here who are pretty familiar with colorectal cancer, they have actually double the rate of stoma at either this operation or another operation. So very, very important for patients. One way historically that surgeons like myself have tried to prevent SSIs is by the way we prepare patients. So there's kind of 4 ways that we historically have done this, and this isn't new. We've been doing this for, well, I haven't, but we've been doing this for about 100 years. The first way is by giving oral antibiotics alone. So this is just a single course, 1 day, 3 doses the day before surgery. So very simple and easy. The second way is by giving mechanical bowel prep. So that's similar to getting a colonoscopy, the same type of prep to clear the colon. Then we've experimented with doing both, as well as neither. So interestingly, like I was saying, this has been around for a very long time, and there was kind of the first study that looked at oral antibiotics and bowel prep was in the 1970s by a group, Clark and Condon, I think this is the American Pathologist group. And this was a really well-done study for the time. It was double-blind, randomized controlled trial, and this actually defined the standard of care for almost 50 years as being oral antibiotics plus mechanical bowel prep. But interestingly, if you look, when I started looking at this topic, I looked back to try to figure out why, because when I trained as a resident, which was not that long ago in 2013, the standard was really nothing. We didn't give any bowel prep whatsoever, and I didn't really understand why. So if you look back at some survey studies at the time, back after the Clark and Condon trials, 85% of surgeons used both together. And this is true up until about the 2000s and 2010s, where those numbers dramatically dropped. And it's interesting because as hard as I tried to look, I could not find any randomized evidence as to why that happened. And piecing it together, I think what really happened was, I'm sure a lot of us here have heard about enhanced recovery after surgery. It's a major program for all different types of surgeries, but very importantly, colorectal cancer. In this group, there was actually 2 non-inferiority studies that were published that looked at bowel prep versus no bowel prep. But very interestingly, they didn't include oral antibiotics. So surgeons like myself who were young abandoned the bowel prep, but at the same time, we also abandoned the oral antibiotics. And if you go back to the commentaries there was actually some senior surgeons in the 2000s that pointed this out, that a fatal flaw of these studies was that we eliminated oral antibiotics. And I thought this was a really interesting quote by Dr. Sirocco from Minnesota. He's recently retired, but he said, "It's been a fascinating journey, an odyssey that colorectal surgeons should fully appreciate to avoid future backslides into the misuse of proven effective methods for elective colorectal operations." These should not have to be rediscovered with each succeeding generation of surgeons. And he referred back to that initial Clark and Condon study that we have actually had the answer all along. Okay, so we come back to the 2010s, and now we have basically what I like to call is a loss of clinical corporate memory. For some reason, surgeons stopped doing something that was the standard of care. Of course, lots has changed in the time. We moved from open surgery to laparoscopic. Lots of other things were done to prevent SSIs as well. But when I started, like I said, the standard was no prep, so no oral antibiotics. Never heard of it, actually. MVP alone was eliminated due to those studies done in the 2000s. And then some of the older surgeons still gave oral antibiotics. Some gave both prep, both without. But these were only really starting to come back into play recently, actually. So it's interesting because you have a situation where you had a gold standard, and now you have this real-world variability in a standard of care, and all these could be considered a standard of care. So of these 4 possible bowel preparation regimens, which one works best? Well, I guess we should run a trial on it, right? That's why we're all here. So Dr. Auer actually first conceptualized this trial, and we decided that we were going to run this basically very simply. So if you wanted to run a trial on this, you would just take all patients undergoing colon surgery, you'd randomize them to oral antibiotics versus no preparation, and we did this simply for a reason, eliminating the mechanical bowel prep group, and then you'd look for surgical infections. We predicted that based on our SSI rates, which I think at the time were 15%, that we need about 718 patients to run this trial. The interesting thing about this is that these drugs are very cheap. It's neomycin and Flagyl, which we've used for 100 years. They have a very, very strong safety profile. They're not really investigational. The other thing was that these were standards of care. If you go to one hospital, a surgeon might give them to you. You go to another hospital, they may not, and the patient wouldn't really know any different most of the time. They just do whatever the surgeon said most of the time. So we thought that it wasn't really a good format to run a classical trial since these were already standards. I think we all know these challenges. Classical trials are very resource intensive to implement, especially for a cheap intervention like this where it might even been cost prohibitive. In order to do this, you need a robust research infrastructure, so trying to run multi-center trials, as I'm sure has been said many times here, you can really only do that at major academic centers. And colorectal cancer, 50% of patients with those diseases are treated at community centers. So we're definitely biasing the results by having all our trials be done at big centers. This also prevents surgeons in those centers from participating, which I think is really important, and then lowers the ability for those surgeons to enroll patients. For patients, there are some really important real-world problems, so to participate in these trials are burdensome. There's extra visits to talk to research coordinators, you have to sign consents, you may have to do extra tests outside of your normal care. And again, patients that maybe want to participate in trials, even trials of simple interventions like this one, can't because the research infrastructure in community centers may not exist. So I didn't think that was right. And finally, I think those community centers, often there's a delay in implementing or knowledge translation of trial results because they're not really in the game in the same way that maybe some centers that have big academic branches are. So when I thought a bit more globally and generally, for a question like this, classical trials had some really, I think, big problems. One, I think, is that if we run all these trials on simple interventions at big centers, I don't think the results are as generalizable to the whole population. We've eliminated a group of patients where they have different social, economic, and geographic constraints to their cancer care. Again, I talked about this, but we reduced the pool of people that are qualified to help run the trials, which is very important. And if you reduce the number of centers, then you have a reduced trial population. So that reduces your efficiency because you can't draw upon those patients to do the trials. So this got Dr. Auer to leverage a pragmatic trial program that was already at the Ottawa Hospital called the REACT program, which is, I'm pretty sure Dean Ferguson is going to talk about tomorrow, I bet. But we leveraged this because it really was aimed at kind of streamlining all of those things that make trials hard to run, but specifically for interventions that weren't investigational. So one of the requirements is that you have to be evaluating a standard of care and one where there's either variability or clinical equipoise. So like a classical RCT, these are supposed to be streamlined, the pragmatic RCTs. They can be cost effective because we embed them in clinical care. So, we do everything right at the clinical visit rather than having a separate visit or a separate infrastructure. And like I've said before, I think it often will increase generalizability, especially in contexts like this where we're not looking at whether the drug works, but we're more looking, does it work in the context of the patient that's getting it? So the React platform really has three major hallmarks. One is an integrated oral consent. So the way this works in our clinic is we'll consent the patient for surgery, and we'll consent them orally. And I'll basically just tell the patient, look, if you'd gone to another hospital, the surgeon may have prescribed the oral antibiotics. If you came here, we may not. In fact, a different surgeon in this hospital may do something different. So do you mind if we let the computer choose? And we give them the patient consent form, and they can read it, and obviously all of the same things apply. They can withdraw whenever they want to. They don't have to participate. But we find that just that simple conversation and not making it this big onerous thing, participation rates are much, much higher. Then if they agree, I can literally pull out my phone and randomize them right there in clinic. Then the randomization algorithm is on the phone, then the master list is on the phone as well, and so everything's done right then and there. They get their prescription, and then they go home. So of course, like we all know, as opposed to the classical RC process, which is costly, inefficient, and for a question like this, I think probably increases attrition. So this is just a quick screenshot of what our phone-based randomization app looks like. It's very simple for, let's say, a surgeon that doesn't have a clinical trial coordinator. You answer 6 quick questions, put in the MRN, put in their name, and then it tells you immediately what group they're allocated to. So this is the first 5 years of the REACT program. These are all non-surgical trials. It was initially kind of focused towards medical oncology practitioners. And they had dramatic enrollment, almost 4,000 patients at the Ottawa Hospital and other 16 sites in Canada, 21 trials. I think these numbers now are about, 9,027 trials, I believe, which is pretty good. We then ran, right before the pandemic, a feasibility study of this trial to compare oral antibiotics and no PrEP and to kind of see what were the trial-related outcomes. So not really looking at the scientific outcomes, but did the trial work and was it useful? And we actually found that if you looked at all of the eligible patients at the Ottawa Hospital, we were able to enroll 90% of them, which I think is much higher than most trials. And of those 90%, 95 were adherent to the treatment because it feels to them like it's just their standard of care. Yeah, that's my theory anyway. So if you kind of translate what this means, basically enrollment was about 10 times higher than most other surgical trials in Canada. And because, I didn't mention this, but because we used NIS QIP to capture data, so NIS QIP is a almost ubiquitous quality improvement program in surgery where lots of metrics are captured by the hospital, and then hospitals are compared across regions. It's so ubiquitous that there's, I think, 50 hospitals in Ontario and hundreds in America that use NIS QIP, and SSI rates are captured in this. So because of that, we effectively had zero loss to follow-up in that pilot because the data was always there. Of course, after, oops, that's backwards, sorry about that. After this, like Enrique was saying, we were all ready to launch a multi-center trial and the pandemic happened, and this was quite challenging. So at the time, our trial was based on having a research coordinator at every site and having someone at that site manage the trial. So as I think we all are well aware now, that old style of clinical trial lacked a lot of resiliency, and you couldn't really do virtual care and virtual research at the time very easily. And at least at the Ottawa Hospital, research coordinators weren't even allowed on site, I think for almost a year and a half or 2 years, which was a really big problem. So we reimagined it into a remote platform. And basically, the hallmarks of this were trying to get unified RAB approvals. That works somewhat. But really, the most important thing was having a central coordinator that could do most of the patient visits, most of the consents, be the first point of contact for the patients at the Ottawa Hospital, and they could do that at any site in Ontario. We also got our pharmacy to mail the drugs to the patients so the products could be delivered directly to them. And then with automatic NISQIP data collection, it was very easy because all the data is collected in exactly the same way at every hospital to access that data directly. Our kind of overall goal here is to kind of have a group of hospitals with NSQIP who can then run trials like this. So what does, in our trial, in the Iraq-NISQIP remote trial, what does the central trial coordinator actually able to do, or the surgeon remotely? So they can do the virtual oral consent and randomization. The surgeon at the site can also do this, but I mean, I'm sure, you know, those of us that have run a trial as the central site, your other sites are usually not quite as invested in you. They might forget, and then you have to have some sort of backup to be able to manage that. We were able, because all the sites were in Ontario, we could actually prescribe the antibiotics ourselves if they were forgotten, and then have those medications mailed anywhere in Ontario. There was a few occasions where we had real-time in-clinic trial support for those surgeons, where, especially in the startup of their trials, they would be in the clinic seeing patients, and then there's one instance where I myself would video chat the surgeon, help them use their app, and then you know, show them where the PICF was and how to kind of do the randomization. And then for those centers that are more community and don't have that infrastructure, of which we have 3, our CRA turns into kind of the first site of contact for the patients at those remote sites. So where are we at with R&R? So we managed to almost finish the study finally after the pandemic kind of derailed us, and open up at 5 different sites, 3 of which were actually remote sites, and 3 of which don't have much research infrastructure, which was really nice. So what are some of the successes? This was actually a really cheap trial. So I think the total budget was only $483,000, and we're nearly done accrual. We did get 3 community sites and their patients to participate without any on-site CRA support, or really any support at the sites whatsoever, except for the surgeons and the nursing staff. Overall, it looks like about 81% of eligible patients at a site were enrolled. That's true for our site. I don't have those numbers for the other sites yet. But NISQIP-wise, when we polled all the other sites, we still probably have about 100% data capture for the primary endpoint because of NISQIP. So what are some challenges? I mean, let's be honest, $483,000 is pretty cheap, and it was probably a little bit too cheap. We probably did need a little bit more budget, probably upfront, because getting some of those remote sites on board was actually quite challenging, because some of those basic things that, you know, I might take for granted, like, you know, GCP or TCPS2, weren't there, and we had to kind of coach some of the investigators into doing those things. And I think one thing that's really important that I definitely don't have as much experience as a lot of you, but I'm starting to realize that some of the barriers we face in Canada, after my experience in Australia, which I think there's a talk tomorrow about that too, which I think will be really good, are pretty fundamental. So some of those barriers to data sharing, you know, we can design whatever trial platforms we want, simplify the way it works, but the bottom line is, in my opinion, this is a legislative problem where we don't have access to data at different sites, we don't have access to data across different provinces because of the way that our healthcare system is set up. Hopefully this is changing though. And like I was saying, you know, one of the things we didn't really anticipate was how long it would take some of the sites that had never done clinical trial before to be onboarded. It took an inordinate amount of time to help them because they didn't have any on-site support to get those certifications and the ethics and that kind of thing approved. Yeah. So what do we want to do with this? I mean, my kind of career goal at some point is to have this be a group of hospitals that can use NISQIP and to use these trials to answer questions that maybe, you know, a pharmaceutical company wouldn't be able to do because the incentives don't line up, or would be really hard to do with the classical trial. I think it's really important. One thing that I'm really a bit passionate about is that I think it's really important that we have these trials run at community sites, and I think the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we can offload a lot of that clinical trial work to a central site. And for diseases like colorectal cancer, I think it's critical because, you know, 50% of those patients aren't treated where I work. They're treated by a general surgeon, you know, in Renfrew or at the Queensway. So thanks for your attention. That's basically all I have, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me.
Thank you, Samir. And in fact, I'm suspecting that many have many questions. It was a lot of information over 3 sessions, but I would say, from my perspective, and perhaps I'll phrase this as an opening question to get us started, please come up to the mics as well, is that each of these different, let me call them initiatives. It's hard to label them as trials, isn't it, after the conversation we've just had, really demanded that you break things, that there was a mindset and a different kind of approach that set these up in new and fresh ways. And while we have, in many ways today, talked about the many, many things that need to be broken and recreated, that are broken and need to be created, it struck me that in each of your presentations, recreating, building, constructing with a patient-first lens or a patient-first a viewpoint really guided your path along the way. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would be interested to understand from each of you that concept of where patient centricity, where thinking about an endpoint, better outcome for a patient really guided your thinking in how you constructed and rebuilt some of these initiatives. So, Pascale, would you like to go first?
So I think we've chosen this business of innovation because we're curious and we want to improve. So when we approach clinical trials in oncology and for oncology patients, I think it became evident that we needed to do things differently because the patients are not the same as what we had. So GSK is doing a lot of respiratory trials and vaccines, and it's not at all the same environment. It's not the same patients, so we needed to approach things differently. We do see, as I mentioned in my presentation, that we are doing all of this for the patients, and if we design trials that are not attracting patients, we are failing. We are failing the patients. We are failing our mission. So I think this is where having a patient-focused and patient-centric approach to our trial, it's really the mutual benefit for the patient, for your institution as caregivers, and for us with innovative medicine that we need. This is essential. It's critical. We need to have this make a success of having the patients. And so that's the approach we take when we start up a new study at a new site or in a new environment. How can, in the end, put the patient on the trial so mutually we can all benefit?
Yeah, and I'll put a build question on that for everyone as well, is that how culturally, transformatively different was that to make that shift? Because there's certainly a lot of understanding and desire to make it so, but regulations and systems and the way things have always been done oftentimes get in the way of making it more patient-focused. I'll let you answer that again.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. For us, it was really internal lesson sharing, let's say. So we work together with our medical colleagues and clinical and global colleagues, and we try and site engagement patients. So internally in in the company I work for, we really try to. We are a small team in the sense that the Canadian colleagues work really closely together. And so for us, it was not that big of a transformation in our culture. We are really trying to put the patients first. We are trying to facilitate the process of getting the medication eventually to the market. But we are all links in this chain, and I think we are used to working in this result-oriented fashion out of curiosity and interest and the desire to fulfill our mission.
Thank you. Enrique, would you like to try?
So I think the three initiatives, I agree they are not clinical trials. I mean, somehow they are, but the main goal was to try to bring patients new opportunities, right? And going more into detail about Octane, that was the main goal of the study. The primary endpoint of the study was to try to bring next-generation sequencing to patients, right? Which is something that, unfortunately, at this point is still not a reality for many of the tumor types, right? So this work was started even before I came to Canada, and I don't want to take credit for what the team at Princess Margaret did, right? But basically, they have to try to convince the institution and also some of the clinicians that this was a good initiative to try to bring patients into research and improve their care. And I think from a cultural perspective that took a lot of time, right? And indeed, there is still some people through an institution like Princess Margaret that they don't believe on these precision medicine-based initiatives because they think that they are not going to help to most of the people. Well, that's partially true, but it helps many people, right? So why don't we try, and why don't we let people have these opportunities to try to improve their outcomes, know more about their disease, and obviously try to share the information. And also about regulation and so, I think the ethics review committee, they do a great job to try to make sure that we stick to ethical framework, also from a legal perspective. But I think there is also a need to try to involve many people on those RABs to try to make sure that they understand why this is important for patients and why sharing this information across the country and across the world is important. So what we are doing here, it matters not only to patients in Toronto, but it also matters to patients in Canada and across the world. So I think that's how work that has been done, and we have to keep pushing for that.
There's 2 points as I kind of, break out into this world of clinical trials and patients. One, I think, it's not a big jump for clinicians because, we have really good mentorship these days about, moving from a paternalistic way of doing medicine to one that is really patient-driven. So I think that part of it is not that surprising from my point of view, but I do think that, we often do research and trials, at least, at some level, we do it because we want to do it, right? But I think that, anytime I've talked to a patient about a clinical trial or enrolling in something or a trial that I'm not involved in, they've always wanted to do it. So I think a lot of it is just friction. It's how do you reduce friction? And I think by making trials easier, you engage patients because it's easier for them to do it. And not even just patients, surgeons as well, right? A lot of times, the reason those patients don't have access is because of friction. So if we can find ways to reduce friction in how we do things, I think that it allows patients to be more empowered.
I think you must have an engineering background as well.
Physics.
Thank you. Great answer. Yes, we've got a question, please.
Great set of talks, so thank you for that. My question's for Enrique. I'm still thinking about the talks that we had this morning about molecular profiling. And you said that in the Octane program, there wasn't an improvement in overall survival, but you were able to match 16% of the population with a matched treatment, and among those 60%, you were able to enroll them on a trial. So I was wondering, within that subpopulation, were you able to see any signals of an improved overall survival?
Thanks for the question. So the study I presented, it was based on a subset of Octane patients. Octane consisted of 6,000 patients. This was made in 700 patients, right? So I would say like it was probably 15% of the full population, right? The study was, that was a study trying to look into cost effectiveness, and one of the things that they look at was about overall survival. And they didn't see that difference, probably because also they matched to another cohort of patients, right? So they were, to be honest, I think the study was not good to evaluate the overall survival population, to be honest. However, we know, because that has been seen in some precision medicine initiatives, that If we are able to match patients to a specific therapy, we can improve outcomes. Overall survival is more difficult to measure because many of these people that they are approached to these therapies are at the end of the life, right? But I think we have seen increased response rates and we have seen progression-free survival, okay? I think the idea in the future is to try to do a big study comparing standard therapy versus NGS. It's very difficult to do that study because obviously there is a cost there and so, but I do believe that there is a benefit. The point is like, I don't think we have a clear comparison between standard therapy versus NGS-guided therapy to say there is improvement over survival in all tumor types. For example, in lung cancer, we know that's the truth, right? In other tumor types, we have still not that data.
Thank you.
Michelle, please.
Okay, so I've got a comment and then a question. And so first, my comment is that I never thought that I would come to a cancer conference and have a fangirl moment, but I am having this moment, and it relates to the Octane trial. When I was up there on the panel earlier, I talked about how I was not included in clinical trials, but I did donate some of my blood and things to research, and that was actually the Octane trial. And so I get really emotional about this because even though it hasn't directly changed my care at this point, so I'm stage 4, I'm on my 4th line of treatment, what it did set off was a cascading events of me going to cancer conferences and then talking to researchers about what's that hope for me in terms of research and making sure that my voice is heard. And so I talked to a researcher who was looking at liquid biopsies, and he said, you know, do you have any NGS data on your tumor? And I showed him the Octane trial, and this researcher in the state knew of the Octane trial. And he said, this is where I think you should be directing your energy and questions. And so that's the power of some of this research, is giving hope to patients that they can advocate. And so some of that now is saying, you know what? I know what is the next line of treatment maybe for me and what side effects I'm willing to put up with. And so, Pascale, you mentioned talking about treatment adherence being a very important thing, and whether it's a question to you or anybody who's in industry or in pharma here is to recognize that it's not a patient choice whether we adhere to the treatment or not. It's a question of the dosing. And a lot of times the dosing in these clinical trials is the maximum tolerated dose. And for somebody like me or those people who are in the metastatic community who are on multiple lines of treatment and our bodies are tired, that maximum tolerated dose is just not acceptable. And it breaks my heart, it makes me cry, because when I go to conferences and I see researchers talking about grade 3 toxicity, and it's okay, we can manage it with treatment. Do you know what grade 3 diarrhea is like? It's not once a day and you just take some Imodium and Bob's your uncle. It's like you're married to the toilet. And I've watched my friends go through that. And I've watched my friends take on clinical trials and the researchers telling them, it's okay, we can manage it. But then they're also looking at building bathrooms and renovating their homes because they can't get upstairs to the bathroom. So we really have to make sure that when we're creating these new treatments that we start getting rid of these grade 3 toxicities, because I can tell you patients don't want it. I don't want it. I don't want it. And so I think looking at treatment adherence and the dose and making sure that that is where the precision oncology is, and making sure that patients are getting the right treatment dose for where they are in the stage of their treatment is really pivotal.
So thanks for your question and your comment. I think you are totally right. I also do phase 1 studies, and I totally get it that for me a grade 3 toxicity is a number. For you, it's not a number, it's a reality, right? And I think it's something that clinicians, we don't need to forget about, right? Having 5% grade 3 toxicity, it could be manageable based on the statistics, but grade 3 means impact in daily life, right? And especially in people who may be sick because of the disease, right? Said that, I think there is a lot of efforts to try to avoid this. I think the FDA bring the Optimus project, which is an effort to try to make sure that we get to the patients the right dose in terms of efficacy and in terms of safety, right? And I'm seeing that many phase 1 studies at this point, they are trying not to arrive to the maximum tolerated dose, and they are trying to stick to a lower dose and then try to check different doses prior to move to phase 2 and phase 3, right? So I think your point is well taken. I think industry and clinicians, we are pushing to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I totally agree with you. We should take into account when we decide which is the dose to be used for a patient, not only on efficacy, but also on toxicity. I totally agree with your point, and I see that every day on practice, that the doses that for all drugs have been approved are many of them, they are not tolerable, right? So that's a very well taken point.
Very last comment.
Yeah, I wanted to see if I could tie this together, because we have an oncologist who's doing molecular profiling or involved in it. We have a colorectal surgeon, and we have a representative industry here. And we were talking about, I'm not sure that everybody knew about the Azure trial. So this is a trial where you get an immunotherapy up front before surgery for rectal cancer patients who happen to be microsatellite instability high. So in other words, you have to test for that. And then if you are microsatellite instability high, then you could have the immunotherapy. And the surgeon's perspective would be, well, we need those patients identified right away at the surgery. So I want to focus on Pascale, your word collaboration. You had one slide on that, but I think it's a very fundamental slide, in the sense that in order for people to get access to that trial, we have to have everything come together. We have to have the surgeon order the test, see the patient and order the test at the right time, and the oncologist has to be involved to get the person into the trial. So that's only the first part, because the second part that Samir, you brought up, was about the sharing of the data. So I just wanted to focus on the collaboration aspect to say how we have to work together if we're going to increase recruitment in trials. Surgeon, oncologist, and industry, in this case, it could be an academic trial, but in this case, industry, have to more closely collaborate to increase that recruitment and identify the right patients for the right trial. And then the second part of the issue is, well, how do we share that data, more rapidly so that patients can better understand the positive effects of being into a trial of this nature? And that is more challenging because, if both of you were in Ontario, the question is, what about the patients in, I'm going to pick a province where I know there wasn't a site, like I think in Manitoba, I don't think there was a site. So how do we get the patients from Manitoba into this trial when the sites are in, Quebec, maybe Ontario and Alberta, let's say, for example. So first question is, how do we get everybody to collaborate more even within the institution from surgery on? And second is, how do we share data better between provinces to encourage patients to participate in these trials? I'll let you decide who takes that.
One of my areas of active research, but I think you're a lawyer, right? Is that right? Yeah, right.
For today, I'm a patient.
Yeah, fair enough. I do think, as I've worked in, I think, 3 different provinces now, as well as in Australia, one thing that really struck me about the Netherlands as well as Australia is the reason why they're able to launch massive trials with smaller populations is because they have almost no friction when it comes to sharing data and having different centers across their countries participate in trials. So Australia, you'll probably hear about tomorrow, has a national RAB where if you are approved for certain types of trials in one center, then you're basically automatically approved, and all you need is internal approval. You don't even need ethics approval. It's just kind of resource-based governance approval. In Canada, if you try to do that, even with the hospital down the road, you often have to redo RAB, redo governance. You have to have a separate data sharing contract with that hospital. And again, I think this probably comes from where in the law the stewards of the data are, which is the institution where the patient is treated. And I think what we kind of need to do as practitioners, I think it's happening now a lot, is advocate for national avenues. National physician licensure is one. Having standing data sharing contracts for even retrospective data across provinces would make a lot of sense. And I think those are things that we probably are not going to be able to solve ourselves without institution to institution, at kind of the Rebecca Auer CEO level, management.
I think the Azure story is amazing, but it's difficult sometimes to recruit these patients into studies, right? With the amazing results of dostarlimab in MSI tumors, I don't think there is any surgeon I know that will say, I want to operate this patient, right? Because I think for the first time, I think we can do better than surgeons for the first time, probably. But the truth is that those studies, those precision medicine studies, because the Azure studies are precision medicine because you're based on MSI, they are not open everywhere, right? And that's a problem, and that's what you're bringing up about collaboration between provinces and between centers. Even in Ontario, which is a huge province, it's difficult to ask a person who comes from Sault-Sainte-Marie to come to Toronto, right, for these studies. But we understand that not every single study can be open everywhere, right? One thing that I think Canada has to do better, I don't know how to improve that, is how people who want to be involved in these precision medicine studies or any kind of clinical study could be able to come to another province and make sure that all the costs are covered and that patient is going to be well taken care. I just have had an experience of a patient coming for a precision medicine study from Alberta to Toronto that took me a month to try to get a letter from Alberta saying, we are going to cover the standard of care cost. That shouldn't take me a month, right? That should be something that Alberta said, oh, we don't have this study here, let's try to help this person to go there. Thanks to the Alberta physician and to the patient that was advocating a lot, we were able to get that letter. But some people come to you and you tell them, the study procedures are covered, but if something happens to you here, I don't know, because you got not approved from your province. So I think that's something that the country has to do better if we want to succeed on clinical trials.
Pascale, last word.
Yeah, so sometimes we can feel as an industry that we are limited because we need to share your voice towards our internal global colleagues, and that sometimes is difficult. So sharing in different forums like this and keeping the lines of communication clear and exchanging really helps us help you to improve our trials. So hopefully we can make some more progress in terms of collaborating. We on our end also try to facilitate as much as we can the inter-provincial patient participation, but we are still limited. So we are partners and we're here to support.
Samir, Pascale, Enrique, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations today and for sharing what needs to happen next. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and come back for the 3 o'clock session. Coffee is at the back.